It was a day like any other in the mountainous Caucasus region of Russia, a place on Earth where life is never easy, but rarely so terrible as it was on September the 1st, 2004. On that day, a band of separatist terrorists from nearby Chechnya stormed into the humble town of Beslan in North Ossetia and began taking hostages. They found those hostages not at a city hall, not at a local business or an apartment block, but at a school. And when they took those hostages, they wouldn't number in the dozens. Instead, they numbered well over 1,000, including nearly 800 children who had all shown up eagerly for the first day of the school year. With the hostage takers entrenched on the command of the feared Chechen warlord Shamil Basayev, the Russian military was forced to answer. But when they did, they would attempt to resolve the situation using the most horrific and the most devastating means at their disposal, attacking the hostage takers, but at incredible cost to the innocents inside. This is the siege of School Number 1, alternately known as the Beslan School Siege and the Beslan Massacre. Now, Russia in 2004 was a nation undergoing rapid change, and very little of it was positive. President Vladimir Putin, still considered in some circles to be little more than a Kremlin figurehead, had just been re-elected to a second term, and the nation was both deep in the throes of technological modernization and starting down a path of striking social and political regression. In hindsight, we know that these were the years that President Putin and his inner circle were working overtime to consolidate their power, isolating and choking out the sorts of political opponents who didn't threaten him much in 2004, but could have if they'd still been in play a decade or two down the road. Putin had sailed to re-election with an official total of nearly 72% of the vote in a campaign that had seen a few brave political rivals drowned in red tape, isolated from the national media, and forced to take security measures to protect themselves, their campaign staff, and even their children. But although most of the Russian Federation was coming slowly and in some ways obliviously under control, one part of the country played by a very different set of rules. That, of course, was Chechnya, where in 2004 a fierce guerrilla conflict still raged to decide the fate of Russia's most dangerous and unruly republic. On the side of the resistance, few names were better known than Shamil Salmanovich Basayev, a brutally violent separatist who had led the Chechen recapture of the republic's capital city of Grozny in 1996 and served on the front lines in conflicts from Nagorno-Karabakh in the 1990s to the Georgian breakaway region of Abkhazia, to both the First and Second Chechen Wars and a series of attacks in the neighboring Republic of Dagestan. Both in his personal demeanor and in his wartime aims, Shamil Basayev was a genuinely terrifying warlord. Video still exists of Basayev nonchalantly watching his own foot be amputated with only local anesthetic after he stepped on a landmine in 2000, and he had a remarkable tendency to escape imminent death across decades of warfare, all the way until the end of his life in 2006. And by the time of the Beslan school siege, Basayev had gained a reputation for planning and perpetrating some of the most brazen and terrifying attacks in modern Russian history. In November of 2002, he claimed responsibility for a hostage crisis at a theater in Moscow in which a force of 50 Chechens had held over 800 theatergoers hostage, only for Russian security forces to inadvertently kill over 100 of these hostages with gas while trying to end the siege. A month later, he had orchestrated vehicle bomb attacks against the headquarters of the Chechen government in Grozny, killing 80, and a similar attack, half a year later, killed 59 more. He led a raid on the largest city of the neighboring Republic of Ingushetia, killing 90, and he directed a bombing on the Moscow metro that killed 41. He made a habit of gunning for the head of Chechnya's Moscow-appointed leader, Akhmat Kadyrov, a head he collected a bit over 3 months before the siege in Beslan by way of a bomb attack. By the late summer of 2004, Basayev was easily the most wanted man in all of Russia, and his name was known globally as one of the most dangerous terrorists in the world, on par with the likes of Osama bin Laden. Now, we're going to say it at the outset of today's video, and we'll be saying it again throughout. Things in Russia were murky at this time. They were very murky. In fact, when it comes to the sequence of events that came next, it is still a controversial claim to accept the idea that Shamil Basayev's Chechen forces were entirely responsible or worked without outside influence. Now, as we're going to explore over the course of this episode, there is a whole lot about what happened at the school in Beslan that does not add up, and that never has. But if anything at all about this siege is really clear, it's that neither the people who carried out the attack nor the people who responded to it seemed to believe at the outset that the Beslan school siege would turn nearly as catastrophic as it did. In modern Russia, September the 1st is known as Knowledge Day. Rain or shine, eager or unwilling, on Knowledge Day, every Russian schoolboy and schoolgirl across every level of elementary and secondary education begin their school year together. In some places, it's a fairly big deal. Kids dress up, go to assemblies, and make good fun out of meeting their new classmates or returning to see friends who've been elsewhere for the summer months. In other places, it's more of a formality, a tough and frustrating day when teachers roll their eyes, roll up their sleeves, and try to corral a group of students who'd rather be anywhere else. In the town of Beslan, it was a festive occasion. Girls wore their finest dresses, boys brought flowers for their teachers, and their parents, we could only assume, breathed a collective sigh of relief that they'd finally get some peace and quiet. But just a few minutes into the school day, at 9:10 in the morning, all hell broke loose. With the school grounds still packed full of children, teachers, and families who might not have otherwise been there, the modest campus was stormed by gunmen. Riding in a police van and a large military truck, wearing green fatigues and black balaclavas, and armed with rifles, handguns, and in some cases explosive suicide belts, several dozen terrorists descended on Beslan School Number 1. Shooting their rifles into the air and quickly dispatching the handful of local police that were present, the terrorists rounded up over 1,100 attendees at the Knowledge Day festivities, including 777 children. The over 1,000 hostages were herded into the school within minutes, forced to squeeze into a newly built gymnasium some 10 meters wide by 25 meters long. Moving through the school, the gunmen found hostages to pry up floorboards and reveal hidden weapons caches, from which they retrieved ammunition and explosives that official Russian sources attest were planted inside the school by maintenance workers before the school year began. The entire building was wired with explosives, including a series of bombs that were hung on a sturdy wire that the terrorists had stretched between the gym's 2 basketball hoops at either end. 2 more terrorists took their seats, strapped into suicide vests with their feet planted on pedals that, if released, would cause their vests to explode. The school's entrances and exits were wired with explosives. The terrorists knocked out all the windows of the school and donned gas masks to prevent a counterattack with gas, and according to some sources, snipers among the gunmen moved to the roof of the school to take defensive positions. School Number 1 was locked down, with hundreds of children and their parents sitting petrified inside. Word about the attack got out quickly to the wider region. Dozens of people had managed to flee the scene and contact local authorities, and before long, Russian troops and police were on their way to respond. But even early in the crisis, Russian authorities were reticent to express the true severity of the incident. Officially, Russia initially reported that only between 200 and 400 people were taken hostage during the siege, and when they finally released what they purported was the accurate count, the number was ridiculously low. 354, barely a third of the number actually held inside. A combination of Russian police, interior troops, army forces, Spetsnaz special forces, and a series of elite police units, collectively known as OMON, established a cordon around the school, evacuating nearby buildings and giving them over to the military units on hand. With them, they brought a crowd of angry, armed civilians and a cohort of Ossetian volunteer militia. This swelled the total outside to above 5,000. And backing them up, they brought tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and other heavy weaponry. What they didn't bring, or at least didn't make ready to respond, was firefighting equipment or any meaningful number of paramedics or ambulances. Inside, the hostage takers had already set to work establishing the brutal order that would rule their and their captives' lives for the next several days. First, one of the local fathers who'd been taken hostage was executed in front of the entire auditorium after the attackers had demanded that the captives speak only Russian and speak only when spoken to. The man had attempted to translate their instructions to the hostage, who understood only the local language, Ossetic, better than they did Russian. A gunman waited until it finished, asked him if he was done, and executed him on the spot. Another father was killed after refusing to kneel for the captors, and shortly afterward the 15 to 20 adults who the attackers considered to be the strongest and thus posed the biggest threat to them were led to a corridor in another part of the school. Minutes later, all but one of them would be executed, some via explosion and some via automatic gunfire. Then, as both sides settled into their positions, it was time for negotiations to begin. As Russian negotiators told it after the fact, the attackers at Beslan never stated their demands in full, although several of the demands were known to the outside world, at least as they were relayed by Russian state media. According to them, the attackers demanded full recognition of Chechen independence at the UN, along with an immediate troop withdrawal from Chechnya and an end to the armed Russian presence there. With these demands came the terms for the siege. If police or the surrounding military forces killed a gunman, they would be punished with the deaths of 50 hostages. If one of the gunmen were injured, then 20 hostages would die. If Russia attacked the school and attempted to break the siege, the school itself would be detonated and everyone inside would die. In response, Russia announced that it would not attempt to take the school by force and that it would instead negotiate in good faith with the hostage takers. The negotiator the attackers had asked for was a man by the name of Leonid Roshel, a pediatrician who had also negotiated a prior siege in 2002. But even as Russia set out to negotiate, we now know in hindsight that they were playing a double game. Civilians on-site negotiated, while the military forces on the premises, led by the Russian FSB, planned to counterattack. Now, quickly, conditions inside the school grew desperate. The terrorists inside refused to allow anybody in the gymnasium, including the children, to eat or drink in what they called a hunger strike, in an attempt to force Russia's hand and make them send North Ossetian President Alexander Jasokov to negotiate. This, despite the extreme heat dehydrating the children inside so badly that, according to many accounts from survivors, both children and adults were forced to drink their own urine and that of others inside in order to survive. Without food, the flowers children had brought for their teachers were the only sustenance most people could find, and they didn't last long. Many of the children, and then the adults, fainted from the fatigue. The militants refused to allow medicine to be sent inside, refused to allow corpses to be removed from in front of the school, and fired grenades at cars that dared to come too close. Enraged by the Russian government's understatement of how many people had been taken captive, the gunmen inside the school acted out their frustrations on the captives. Meanwhile, abroad in Jordan, Vladimir Putin himself hardly acknowledged the crisis at all. One bright spot came in the second afternoon of the siege, when ex-presidents of Ingushetia, Ruslan Ulshev, arrived on the scene. Ulshev was allowed to enter the school, and when he left, he took with him all 15 infants present at the scene, along with 11 nursing mothers. He also carried out a videotape showing the children and the situation inside the school, and a note that allegedly included demands made directly by Shamil Basayev, formal independence from Chechnya, in exchange for an offer to take responsibility for a series of deadly bombings in 1999 that Basayev and the Chechen separatist movement had vehemently denied taking part in. Later that night, the situation inside the school devolved even further. According to survivors who reported their experiences later, the hostage takers inside had become unpredictable in their behavior, and at times even hysterical. Current theories blame anything from sleep deprivation to drug withdrawal to high stress to irritation at the children crying inside. By the morning of the third day of the siege, it was increasingly clear, both inside and outside the school, that something would have to give, and give soon. In the early hours of day 3, a new figure was set to enter the siege, Aslan Mashkatov. He was the president in exile of the unrecognized independent Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. Although Mashkatov was broadly seen as an opponent of the Kremlin in Moscow, his was a voice that Russian leaders hoped might be able to calm tensions inside the school and lead to real negotiating progress. By all accounts, the terrorists inside the school were, by this point, ready to at least attempt negotiating with the outside world on how to end the siege for good. Mashkatov got on a plane with the intent to come and negotiate directly, and according to some sources within the Russian operation around the school, the siege appeared as if it might actually be resolved sooner than later. But the desire to see a peaceful end to the siege was not nearly so uniform among the Russian forces outside School Number 1 as we might like to imagine. In fact, other elements within the Russian siege were anything but friendly toward the idea of a peaceful resolution. Alexander Jasokov, the North Ossetian president that we mentioned earlier, and who the hostage takers had asked for directly, was barred from contacting or speaking with the terrorists directly. In fact, he was threatened with arrest if he attempted to make contact, and he was prohibited from taking part in the FSB's plans to take the school or even entering their headquarters on premises. As we mentioned previously, there were 2 rescue efforts ongoing outside the school simultaneously. The civilian one that took cues partially from North Ossetian Governor Zashakov, and the FSB-led operation which had zero intention of listening to him or any other civilian who would talk of a peaceful resolution. And although it's never been outright confirmed, it seems from the outside that the decision to bring Chechen president in exile Mashkatov to School Number 1 set off a ticking clock for those who wanted to resolve the siege by force to take action before their opportunity was gone forever. At 1 in the afternoon on the third day of the siege, not long before Mashkatov was due to arrive and begin his negotiations, School Number 1 was rocked by 2 separate explosions. The first came from inside the gymnasium, at the precise moment that a group of 4 paramedics were slowly approaching the school in an agreed-upon operation to retrieve and remove 20 bodies from the school grounds. When the explosion rang out, the terrorists inside the school responded with gunfire, killing 2 of the paramedics and forcing the others to flee. A few seconds later, another explosion hit the school. According to investigator Marina Litvinovich reporting the results of a later fact-finding operation, both explosions had come from Russian troops firing grenade launchers directly toward the auditorium. Said one survivor after the fact, "It was as if something had flown in, a giant ball of fire. Within minutes, much of the ceiling in the gymnasium was on fire, causing the roof to buckle and then collapse inward on the children and adults inside. For the children who did manage to escape, and some who might otherwise have been able to, the effects of dehydration were often so severe that they were hardly able to force their bodies to carry them away from the rapidly spreading flames and the firefight that had kicked off outside. Some 160 people were killed by the collapse and the fire, and from there, things would only get worse. After the explosion, a small number of hostages were able to run for the exit, while the hostage-takers, now disoriented and attempting to keep their hostages alive, ushered others toward the school cafeteria in a different part of the building. Hostages were lined up along the windows of the gymnasium in an attempt to show Russian troops outside that women and children were in the direct line of fire, but it didn't matter. Using tanks, flamethrowers, and grenade launchers, Russian forces carried out their assault, while soldiers armed with rifles traded fire with the militants that they could see inside. More hostages would die in the crossfire, and although the Russian government would later assert that they'd only attacked in order to stop the hostage-takers from killing their hostages they ran away, accounts from the ground directly contradict that account. As the assault continued, tanks and even an armed attack helicopter kept up direct fire on both hostage-takers and hostages, while the militias and civilians outside attempted to storm the school themselves. At the fringes of the Russian government lines, local police and inexperienced military conscripts panicked and even fled. At least 3 highly destructive Shmel rockets, described in most Western nations as thermobaric weapons, were fired directly at the school, and at least 1 armored vehicle fired a heavy machine gun directly into the school's second story. Many students and adults who had stepped into Russian troops' lines of sight were killed where they stood, including at least 100 who died after the majority of the surviving hostages were moved from the gymnasium to the cafeteria. As the battle wore on, more and more of the school was brought under control of the Russian military, and the surviving militants on the premises were pushing back to the basement or forced to flee. One group of gunmen was cornered in a nearby building, which was razed to the ground with flamethrowers and tanks, while another group was chased into Beslan proper and killed. When firefighters eventually arrived on the scene, called in a full 2 hours after the battle began, they were unable to control the fire for several more hours. Because so few paramedics had been present, many of the wounded were driven in cars to the nearest hospital. Through the night, a handful of escaping gunmen were pursued. Several were killed and possibly mutilated by Russian troops, and one was captured. A further one was lynched by an angry mob. And by the time the sun rose on Beslan the following morning, 186 child hostages, 128 adult hostages, 19 rescuers, and 31 gunmen had been killed, alongside over 1,200 injured people, in what was the deadliest end to an on-the-ground terror attack in recorded human history. Amidst the shock and the horror of the battle at School Number 1 were an endless series of raw and incredibly painful questions, many of which have still gone unanswered to this day. Why did the Russian troops choose to attack the school when a peaceful end to the siege was so close at hand? How had so many people been killed? By whom? And for what purpose? And who had launched the first explosive? Who had started the fire? And why were so many children dead when by every indication before and since, they did not need to die? The Russian official response to the crisis was predictably opaque. An investigation spearheaded by a close ally of Vladimir Putin with a long relationship with the Russian FSB would claim over 2 years later that a terrorist had intentionally detonated a bomb in order to start the fighting, and as the report described, that terrorist had been, quote, acting according to a plan developed earlier. Of course, that report found that no Russian authorities had done anything remotely wrong, and that tanks, flamethrowers, and other deadly weapons had been deployed only after the last hostages were extracted from the school. Not only did those claims fly in the face of hundreds of eyewitness accounts, but they were inconsistent with the findings of every attempted investigation that could be described, even loosely, as being credible. According to another source, an investigation done by North Ossetia itself, the initial explosion inside the school came after a sniper had shot one of the terrorists who was sat with their foot on a detonator, causing that detonator to be triggered and likely killing or maiming several of the hostages around them. Another investigator, this time an independent expert from the Russian Duma, came to the same conclusion that we stated earlier, that Russian special forces had launched grenades toward the school without warning. Later video revealed conversations between Russian prosecutors and army engineers who explained to the prosecutors that the terrorists' own bombs featured ball bearings meant to create shrapnel, and that none of the bodies of the children recovered at the scene showed any evidence of ball bearing-like shrapnel injuries. And although it's only a single, standalone quote, one statement by a survivor is most striking of all. As they recalled after the fact, a shocked gunman inside the gymnasium had said after the first explosions began, quoting, "Your own people blew you up." And while the Russian government would later attempt to claim genuine care and attention toward the victims of the siege, their conduct in the following hours and days told a very different story. At Beslan, relatives of the wounded were prohibited from entering hospitals, while doctors were only allowed to assist with the wounded after having given up their mobile phones. In the days after the attack, bulldozers would clear out the debris without even attempting to collect the human remains there. Vladimir Putin made only a token visit to Beslan Hospital and did not seek out any interactions with the families of the victims. He faced brutal waves of public anger and condemnation after the siege concluded, although none of that condemnation was enough to push him out of office. Putin insisted after the attack that it had been planned and carried out by actors outside Russia, even from the West, although no evidence to support that claim was ever presented. But like any good autocrat, Putin didn't allow the Beslan crisis to go to waste. Instead, he used it to his personal benefit in order to hasten along the long, slow consolidation of power already underway inside Russia. He expanded the powers of the FSB and other federal Russian law enforcement agencies and announced a law just days after the attack that regional governors within Russia would no longer be elected by their own people, but appointed by the Kremlin. Members of Russia's lower house of parliament would no longer be elected either. Instead, they'd be chosen by political parties who citizens would vote for without any knowledge of who those parties might choose to appoint. Speaking of political parties, all would be made to re-register within Russia, and most that tried would ultimately have their applications denied. All legislation coming to the Russian lower parliament would now be reviewed by a separate Putin-appointed chamber before ever being taken up for consideration, leaving Vladimir Putin as the sole federal-level elected official in Russia. Moscow used the opportunity to extend its hooks deeper and deeper into the national media and used the siege as justification to restrict the work of foreign, non-government organizations. On the ground, the human cost to survivors was immense. Many of the children who'd been present at the school during the hostage crisis were permanently disabled, and a full month after the attack concluded, 240 people, including 160 children, were still receiving medical treatment. In Chechnya, the siege and its brutal conclusion raised fears that Chechens would be regarded around the world as monsters, and that any remaining hopes for Chechen independence were functionally lost. Those fears were ultimately borne out, and in the wake of the siege, even Shamil Basayev's separatists declined to carry out mass attacks for several years, including after Basayev's death. Chechen leaders spent years denying involvement in the crisis, and although Basayev issued a statement claiming responsibility for the attack using a so-called Brigade of Martyrs, he added that he had miscalculated the willingness of Russian leaders to negotiate toward a peaceful settlement rather than attacking the school and inciting a mass casualty end to the siege. Arslan Maskhadov, the president in exile that we mentioned earlier, would have a $10 million bounty placed on his head after the incident and did die 7 months later in an attack in Chechnya by Russian commandos. And even though Russian officials insisted that they'd accounted for each of the attackers, confirming all but one of them as dead, surviving eyewitnesses have long claimed that the true number of terrorists was far higher. Several among the purported attackers that have since been unaccounted for were reported as having spoken perfect Ossetian, and some reports estimate that anywhere from 34 to over 75 militants might have taken part in the attack, including foreigners from Arab nations. Shamil Basayev claimed that 33 militants took part in the attack, although, like everything else, Basayev said in the wake of the incident that testimony is tainted somewhat by the conflicting reports that during the crisis, a note purportedly from Basayev had offered to take credit for the bombings in Russia that Chechen separatists had previously denied having carried out. Believe that Basayev might have been willing to take credit for those attacks, and it becomes very difficult to conclusively deny that he might have spread other messages on Russia's behalf later on. If anything is clear, 20 years after the conclusion of the Beslan massacre, it's that the ultimate end to the crisis did not need to happen as it did. The hostage takers at School Number 1 were undeniably responsible for creating a hostage situation in the first place, for killing several civilians, and subjecting over 1,000 people, including hundreds upon hundreds of children, to terror and physical hardship that would have scarred them for life even without the carnage that ended the incident. But blame for the firefight that claimed hundreds of innocent lives, blame for the destruction of School Number 1, and blame for the willful decision to resolve the hostage crisis with incredible violence just hours from a possible peaceful end lies exclusively on the Russian troops and federal authorities who chose to attack. The fallout from the siege, as brutal and horrific as it was for both those killed and those who survived, has been used shamelessly to prop up the same regime that rules Russia today. The legacy of the attack on School Number 1, the deadliest end to a terrorist siege in all of recorded history, is inseparable from the legacy of modern Russia. And the role of the modern Russian state in the deaths of hundreds of innocent people in Beslan must never be forgotten, so long as that regime still stands.